Hello everyone, and thank you for joining this Yara webinar on the topic of multi-species swards and herbal leys. And I should add at this point that when we say multi-species swards or herbal leys, they both mean the same thing. So you may hear us at one stage using one term and then changing to another term, but we mean the same thing. I'm delighted that Dr. Thomas Moloney and Damian McAllister from DLF Ireland are able to join me today for this discussion on the benefits of multi-species swards, but also at a practical level, how do we establish and manage them? There is certainly a lot of research going on in this area, and with new environmental schemes supporting their establishment both sides of the Irish Sea, then for many farmers it'll be the first introduction to growing multi-species swards. So with further ado, we'll just I'd like to introduce both Thomas and Damian to the conversation. And I suppose if we'd like to start off with you, Damian, if you wouldn't mind just giving a quick introduction of what you're doing and maybe an overview of what DLF are doing in this whole area.
Okay, hello, I'm Damian McAllister, work for the plant breeder DLF. We're predominantly a breeder of perennial ryegrass and white clover, and also the herbs as well. So I've been in the trade for over 10 years working with the grass seed. So the whole herbal ley thing's coming on board, really driving by because of the price of nitrogen and soil health and soil fertility. So we're one of the largest breeders of plants, and most recently we've joined alliance with a company in the southern hemisphere called PGG Wrightson's, and they would have a strong background in plantain and chicory and other herbs. So we're learning a lot from them too. So we have a lot of research sites, and we have partner farms where we're putting these herbal leys in now just to test them, how they do in real life as well as in research plots.
Good. And it's funny you say that, Damian. When I was in New Zealand back, it's a good while ago now, but I was down in on a Landcorp farm, working on a Landcorp farm down in Manapuri, down in the southwest, the South Island. And I remember we used to graze mobs of yearling Angus bulls on swards of basically perennial ryegrass, clover, plantain, and I think there was chicory in it as well. So they've obviously got you know, a good few years experience in those crops down in the southern hemisphere.
Mm-hmm. And we had a recent conversation with the New Zealand guys, and what they find strange is that it's the more intensive guys in UK and Ireland now that are looking at these multi-species, and they wonder why it's the obvious choice that the less intensive men have more to gain from it, which I thought was a fair point.
Okay.
They would also make the point that the New Zealand government would be trying to push more for very diverse variety or mixtures such as 10, 14 species, but they would still recommend narrowing it down to the species that do well, and that being your 6 species standard herbal ley, if you like.
Okay. And Thomas, just if what are you doing in your capacity for with DLF, and just I suppose the other question would be like, what are the you're an elevator pitch, for a selling a farmer, to try multi-species swards, like what are the the main benefits for farmers using multi-species swards, the whole gambit of both the economic and environmental elements of them?
Yeah, so firstly, I suppose my role at DLF is on the product and technical manager at DLF for the last 2 years, going into my 3rd year now. And I suppose I'm kind of looking after bringing new products or new varieties on stream, and looking at new mixtures, things like that. And obviously, we do a lot of work we have a trial site down in County Waterford where we do our perennial ryegrass evaluation, and we also have a few multi-species trials and things like that going on too, and look after our partner farmers too. So I'm kind of on the R&D side. The benefits of multi-species, I suppose there's a lot of benefits, and it depends on where you're coming from a production side of things, and as farmers, so that's what we're most interested in. You're talking about compared to all our comparisons today are going to be to your conventional ryegrass sward receiving a decent amount of nitrogen fertilizer. So compared to that, your multi-species sward can maintain your herbage production or your yield over the year on much less fertilizer. And in some cases, we're seeing farmers using no nitrogen fertilizer at all in these swards. So obviously that's a big topical issue now in the last 6 months. And we also see strong animal performance benefits too. So animals are responding really well to these mixtures, and I suppose it's the diversity in the mixtures and the different nutrients that the different species bring, and the different mineral profiles that they have is helping the animals, and we're seeing increased intakes and increased animal performance as a result from these mixtures. So there's a lot of benefits, and it depends on the system what benefit is most applicable to you, I suppose.
And from a biodiversity perspective, I know, Damian, from chatting to you about this before, you were, I think, on your own farm, you know, you've multi-species swards, and you were commenting on the difference with regards to, you know, during the season with the amount of insects that are visible with on those lays that you've
yeah, well, if you walk through the grass only lays, there's very little activity in terms of nature, whereas when you go through your multi-species, you have flowering species there, so you're seeing a lot more pollinators, and they just bring other things. And people forget, like, if there's more birds or more pollinators in your field, they're all adding biology to your soil. Without those, your soil biology wouldn't be as rich compared to perennial ryegrass alone. So, and you get a better feel for your farm too. You get a better, let's say, a better sense of well-being in yourself. That it's maybe a more natural approach, and you're farming more with the environment.
Okay, and just from, has there been, I suppose, in the work that you guys are doing, are there benefits to multi-species swards with regard to, say, soil structure? I know there are some, you know, farmers would be using it as part, you know, in an arable rotation, but are there benefits there with different species, and how they may, I suppose, improve soil structure where maybe soil structure is slightly below where you'd like it to be?
I think that from an arable rotation point of view, it really is ideal, because it will improve soil structure. But most importantly, the biggest issue with multi-species is the control of weeds. So if you're coming out of an arable rotation, you'll find there's very little weeds, maybe some annual weeds, and they'll just graze out or just cut out. But I'm finding that the most successful multi-species lays are that of an arable rotation because of that. And then they're putting it, laying down some nitrogen. So say in a 3-4 year rotation, you could be back to cereals and reaping the rewards in terms of the subsequent crops.
Okay, and Thomas, is it, I guess, you know, soils differ across both, you know, the island of Ireland and Great Britain, and are these multi-species swards, you know, are they more suitable to certain soil types, drier soil types, and for those, say, in wetter areas or heavier soils, you know, is it a matter of that they will work, but maybe you need to tweak the actual species that you're including in them, or, you know, will the same kind of type of number of species work regardless of where you're farming?
Yeah, so obviously, so say if we take the 6 species mixture as the template, obviously there's 6 different species in there. They're not all going to have the same optimal growing conditions, climate-wise or soils-wise. So yeah, there are some of them that will like where a given situation, and some of them that won't like it as much as the others. But I think that diversity is kind of your insurance. So you'll still have a large proportion of that mixture that will thrive in any given location. So if you think about what's in the 6 species, is usually perennial ryegrass, timothy, red clover, white clover, plantain, and chicory. So I presume everybody is growing perennial ryegrass and white clover, whether you're in dry soils, heavy soils, whatever. So we know that works. Timothy as well, we know that works in slightly harsher climates. It performs well in either in colder, wetter soils, and it's a bit hardier that way. And then if you go towards the drier end of the spectrum, you're looking at things like chicory, which is probably the most drought tolerant one in that mix. It loves the warmer the weather, the better for chicory, really. And so across that 6 species, you've a good you're covered really for a wide range of conditions. And obviously there are things that you can add in, maybe more minor species that you could add in that would really like being in particularly wet or dry conditions. But I think you're fairly well covered with a 6 species mix. And as Damian said, they're kind of they're the top agronomic varieties and species in their class. So once we start adding in more species, getting up to 10 and 14, their persistence and their suitability to a conventional agricultural system or a rotational grazing system, we'll say, becomes less and less, and you're kind of being penalized that way for the gains that you might make up for having a species that's really suited to the particular environment.
And is there, do you see that, I know, Damian, you mentioned it earlier on about your colleagues down in Southern Hemisphere, about, I suppose, where they feel that it may have the most benefit. But do you see that, you know, yourselves, you know, is it a case of where they are basically a good option on, say, for example, an intensive dairy grazing system, that are maybe either using, I suppose, perennial ryegrass only swards at the moment? Do you think is there scope for those farmers to use them, that particular cohort of farmers to start using multi-species swards, or where, you know, obviously use a portion of their paddocks in say multi-species sward mixtures to I suppose dip their toe in that in this?
Yeah, well, we're seeing that there, and maybe at the max you could possibly consider 40%, say, of herbal there, possibly more. It'll be personal choice. The fear is that there'll be a limitation in terms of spring growth, because legumes are slower to get going in the spring, obviously. So what we do, we try and pick grass varieties that are in that 6 species that are naturally higher in spring growth to balance that out. And the multi-species swards actually grew very well over the winter and the spring this year, albeit it was a warm winter now. But that's only danger. So for the paddocks that you're generally going out on first in the springtime, that you'd maybe keep them grass only. And the herbal leys need to be grazed well before you come into the winter time. So for that reason, they may be the last graze, so they're never going to be the first graze come the new grazing season.
And is that last grazing, to graze them last, is that obviously to open up the sward so that they're, you know, it helps them then come the springtime?
It's more to, if you have a high cover of legumes and herbs going into the winter time, you can get a bit of winter kill. So you just want to defoliate that there to reduce the risk of frost affecting them.
Okay. And I suppose the other thing, and it's a question that comes up a lot, is, you know, are they suited, multi-species swards or herbal leys, you want to call them herbal leys, are they suited to, you know, making silage from them? And whether that's silage from, you know, your traditional kind of, you know, maybe 2-cut system, then followed by grazing, then cut for maybe first cut and then grazed afterwards, or maybe even on some farms where, you know, where there's a multi-cut system in place, have they got a place there, or is it something where you obviously use different species to suit that kind of system?
You can make silage with them. It's a bit more tricky than with perennial ryegrass, and I suppose that's where the whole farm approach comes in, with what Damian was saying about having a proportion, maybe up to 40%. and having some grass paddocks there as backup, either early in the spring or as your silage ground. That would be kind of my rule of thumb, would be to have enough grass to produce enough silage for yourself, because it is easier to make your silage with grass than it might be with multi-species. But saying that, the silage aspect would have been what my own PhD was on a few years ago, and we found that when conditions were good, and when weather conditions were good, and when they're ensiled properly and quickly, they would preserve well as silage. But in this case, water is really your enemy. They've got a much higher moisture content than perennial ryegrass does. So you just have to make sure that you're getting a good wilt. You're cutting a dry crop. You've got a couple of days dry weather, a good window of dry weather to make sure that you can get the crop dried and ensiled that way. But I think the best value for farmers to get the best value from these swards is probably as a grazing mixture. A grazing mixture throughout the summer is probably where your best bet is. And again, as I said, simpler to make your silage with ryegrass. But if you've if you've paddocks that you think are getting a bit strong for you, there should be no issue with ensiling this stuff as long as weather is right.
Another thing to realise, that if you feel like your herbal ley, your traditional, say your 6 species with chicory and plantain, if you feel it has got a bit strong, I would say don't be scared to put the cattle in to graze it. If it does get ahead of them, you'll find they'll do a better job grazing that out than they would a grass only sward that has gone past the ideal stage for grazing. And don't forget, when you take this for silage, you're not adding to the soil biology. The whole cattle grazing it and manuring it and the saliva, that's important to keep that process cycling all the time. And it's a lot cheaper if you can just put it straight into their mouth.
Yes, and that's another. I was going to maybe talk about this maybe later on, but I should probably. It seems like a good time to bring up the question in you know, obviously, whether it's a beef or sheep farm or whether it's a dairy farm, and I suppose traditionally in managing, whether it's a perennial ryegrass for grazing, grazing perennial ryegrass or maybe a mixture of perennial ryegrass and clover, there's very kind of there is you could say there's a routine there with regards to covers, and there's a lot of work gone into, I suppose, measuring and managing that, and getting the right covers, basically residuals left, and then grazing at certain covers. And I think you just mentioned that. But what I've been on farms where these multi-species swards, where you would think that they were gone way too strong and they're being grazed, and farmers are very happy, and they may have started with initially maybe grazing lighter covers, but they've kind of they've changed to allow the actual swards to be, I suppose, get a little bit heavier than what they would be normally accustomed to on both beef and sheep farms and dairy farms. But what with that in mind, is there have you a few tips on what you guys feel like is the right way to manage them in a rotational grazing system?
I would say, well, from personal experience, I wouldn't have stock any longer than 4 days, and then I would be moving them on. The rotational length will vary across the year. So midsummer, you could be in and out there every 21 days, but you want to be extending that there at the shoulders, just to you have to get a lot of leaf built up there, so before it's grazed, the energy starts going back into the root, so it can regrow. And some farmers are still putting on too much fertilizer, and you really have to believe in clover. If you don't believe, you have to believe in the system, if you like. You have to believe that this clover really will grow grass.
You have to let it do its thing.
And what kind of, on a well-established sward, multi-species sward, like what is the what is the kind of the clover content that you would be hoping to achieve or try to maintain?
It varies throughout the year. Obviously, as Damian said earlier on, the legumes have different peak growth rates throughout the year. So I suppose you'd be this time of the year now, you'd probably be starting to see it increase up to between 20 and 30%. And then it'd probably maintain that well into September, October if the ground is still, if conditions are still good, growing conditions are still good. I think just on the grazing thing, I agree with Damian, but I don't think it's as far removed from what we're used to with our rotational grazing system that we would have in place for a ryegrass sward. And I think that probably one of the benefits of the herbal leys would be that it is more forgiving in terms of it doesn't run away out of control if you don't hit it on the 21st day in the middle of summer. You know, it allows you a bit more flexibility. And if you think about that again on the whole grazing system, if you've got paddocks, grass paddocks somewhere else that maybe need a bit more urgent attention, you can make the decision: do you go to your herbal ley now, or do you leave it off? Because it'll give you that couple of days flexibility without suffering in intakes or in grazing. So I think they could be useful in that sense as well.
And Thomas, are you still looking at that kind of 4 centimeters residual, or is that, or is it slightly higher, or is it, for on these multi-species?
Yeah,
is it desirable to maintain it at 4 centimeters like what we're typically used to with perennial ryegrass swords?
Again, from talking to farmers out on farm as well, it seems that animals really like their multi-species swords, and it might be hard to keep them back from grazing it down to 4 centimeters. But it's a lot more open, the sward, as well, so it's kind of hard to judge whether you're at 4 or 6, and the preferential grazing and things like that. It's kind of hard, but I'm not sure will grazing it at 6 centimeters rather than 4 prolong the lifespan of things like red clover or chicory. Anyway, I think the nature of the plants, they're kind of on 3 or 4 year life cycles anyway, so that's probably as long as they're going to last in a sward. So I think while they're there, we should utilize them to the best that we can. And it's the guys in the southern hemisphere as well, they seem to be grazing them regularly as grass swards, and just getting full value out of them while they're there. And then after that, we can see about topping them up or where we go after that then.
Okay. And I guess from a nutrient perspective, and I'm very interested in the nutrient side of this, in managing these swards with regards to nutrient applications, not just when I say nitrogen, but obviously both the other nutrients like phosphorus and potassium, sulfur, and then we're looking at, I suppose, some of the trace elements or micronutrients as well. But
yeah.
Can you give me a kind of a quick, well, it doesn't necessarily have to be quick, but a summary on what you're finding anyway at managing these nutritionally, these swards?
Nutritionally, I suppose that's the building blocks of any crop that you're trying to grow. So your PK, pH obviously has to be in good order. So we would be recommending or advising that your P and K status is in index 3, is in the optimal category, and your pH obviously is between 6.2 and 6.5, and that's your sweet spot really for the availability of all the nutrients, the macro and the micro. They're all at their most available to the plant in that level of pH. And I think there's a big emphasis on pH now in the last while with the way things are with nitrogen fertilizer, and we're starting to realize that it is a very valuable input into our cheap and economic input into the system. So as long as we have those building blocks in place, PK and pH, that's when all these species, not just ryegrass, the clovers and the herbs, perform at their best when they're in a fertile soil. So our advice would be similar to a grass sward in that case. Yeah.
And just for either yourself, Thomas, or Damian, with regards to nitrogen applications and timings of those nitrogen applications, is it obviously there, I think it was mentioned earlier on about that, some of these swards won't need any nitrogen at all, but for those swards, is there for where nitrogen is going to, is there a time when nitrogen is applied, or is your, it's best to apply nitrogen, I suppose particularly in maybe early spring, at a time when these swards may I suppose the actual ryegrass content and other grass species would benefit from that first application early in the spring?
Yeah, all the research coming out the lines of state, which is world leading, I suppose. They were putting nitrogen on at 90 kilos to the hectare, and that was all front loaded in the spring. Don't believe there was any. There was no mid-season or autumn application at all. So it's just the legumes are slower to get going in the years, you know. So if you can feed the grass early, the grass will grow. And the whole science is, if the grass is growing well in the spring, it's not really out competing your legumes because they're dormant at that stage. So, well, cut off the fertilizer after spring and let the clover take over then.
A lot of the research trials are having, as Damian said, it's front loaded, and the 1st of May is their cut-off point for any nitrogen that's going out. Yeah.
Okay, and I guess when it comes to you know, the likes of sulfur applications, I know on, you know, perennial ryegrass and perennial ryegrass and clover swards on, you know, on intensively stocked farms, that you know, sulfur, I suppose sulfur can be forgotten about, because generally sulfur is coming from you know, is being applied in a nitrogen containing fertilizer. So if, you know, on those swards that are receiving kind of typically, you know, a perennial ryegrass only swards that are receiving nitrogen and sulfur, but then you switch over to, say, a clover, including clover, you're obviously not going to be putting on as much nitrogen, but you're not going to be putting on as much sulfur either. But it's, I think, looking at you know, that those swards do benefit from getting some extra sulfur, because I guess there's nitrogen being fixed, and I suppose there's whether it's perennial ryegrass or clover, sulfur is needed there for the plant, and when it's for optimum growth during the course of the year. But do you think that sulfur is something as well, guys, that would be beneficial on these swards?
Yes, suppose the soil test maybe show you that there. You go by, that'll show up on your analysis where you're at for sulfur. Well, on the micronutrients, not much talked about, but the likes of boron deficiency can be an issue in clover. So if you're really serious about growing legumes in your farm, you really need to be paying attention to boron and molybdenum too, because you'll start to see deficiency within the plant there, that there reduce the amount of persistency of the legumes.
Yeah, and I guess I see it here myself, where I've done small trials at home here, where with clover, that certainly with regards to potash and some of the other nutrients, that it does like good soil fertility, because I can see here where the you know, where I've kind of not applied any potash or potassium applications, where it has where you can see the deficiency coming in, where it doesn't seem to be impacting, not visually anyway, the grass, but yeah, obviously the yields have come back. But just that was something I've noticed here at home, where I've looked at clover and particularly potash. But another question, and I think I'd asked you this before, Thomas, about, I suppose, slurry applications, that, you know, our slurry applications, obviously come May, you were saying about, you know, trying to cut out nitrogen applications after from kind of early May onwards. You know, for those farmers who have slurry to apply, is you know, is it still okay to go on with slurry in that scenario?
Yeah. Obviously, it depends on demand, and each farm is unique in terms of their system. So whether you want to apply that nitrogen, if you've got big demand in the spring, you might want to apply the chemical form of nitrogen, and if you're a bit lax on the demand in springtime, then slurry is ideal. There's enough nitrogen there to keep things ticking over, and again, you're topping up your P and K, which is a critical one for these swards in particular. So yeah, we're seeing one of our partner farms, Kevin O'Hanlon, would follow maybe every second round with some watery slurry, just to keep P's and K's topped up, and it seems to be all they need in terms of nutrients, as long as you're already up there in those optimal indexes. Top up is with slurry, it seems to be working out well.
And applying that with a dribble bar as opposed to a splash plate, just to you know, and not to make it unpalatable with the slurry, just trying to reduce the amount of leaf contact. So going straight on after it's grazing and using the dribble bar.
Okay. And I guess if we're to get into the practical more, I suppose, in establishing this, so if for farmers, as some of these environmental schemes, farmers are going to be establishing these types of swards, you know, so can we, I suppose, just go through, you know, how best to establish these, and maybe briefly on the individual species, on, you know, I guess some of them are more persistent than others, I think, within that mix. But if you wouldn't mind kind of going through a kind of a blueprint for a farmer looking to establish a best establishment guide for multi-species swards, herbal leys, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, well, if the conventional plough and till, fine seed bed, you have to remember you're working with very small seeds here. So the most important thing is to roll it before you sow it. So roll, sow, and roll again. From the fertilizer point of view, I would be putting on a low nitrogen fertilizer, such as your potato type fertilizer, your 824s or 24, something like that. A couple of bags to the acre, and then just let it get established. Wouldn't be putting on any nitrogen there. Say, for example, if that was a spring sowing, I wouldn't be putting on any more nitrogen for the rest of the season. You could also direct drill your herbal leys by direct drilling. So if you have an existing grass ley and it's burnt off, that can act as a weed barrier, which helps. So if you direct drill your herbs, they'll be coming out, and you haven't, as opposed to plough and till. Plough and till can obviously raise a lot of weeds, so you have less soil disturbance with the direct drill, but you just have to watch out there's not too much trash there. You want to minimize the amount of trash, just to let the seedlings get established. But on the farm, I've did it both systems, and both have worked well.
And is there any, like, you know, traditionally a lot of grass reseeds were sown in the autumn time. Probably a move to maybe more doing it earlier now, but you know, is it better to establish these, and, you know, is it end of April, early May? Is that a better time of the year, or is it?
I'll be trying to get people into May time, assuming you just really have to avoid a dry spell if possible at all. The earlier you get it in, the better. It gets the roots down there. It goes into the winter as an established plant rather than a seedling. And if sown in May, you would actually be surprised about the production in year one. Compared to a grass only sward, you would be getting more production. So, for example, I sowed 20th of May last year and got 5 grazings and a winter graze after that.
Okay.
So,
probably the safest, this was there's no chemical options for post-emergent sprays or anything like that. So the safest bet is probably get it sown around about now or into May, as Damian said. So you've got temperatures are increasing, weather conditions are at their best, so you're going to get a strong sward established. Whereas you leave it too late into the autumn, things are starting to slow down. There's more chance for weeds to get in, and then you could potentially have a problem then, because you've nothing to solve that problem with, really.
Okay, and what, you know, when it's established, you know, regards to at what stage do you graze it? Is it like a more perennial ryegrass type situation, you know, that you lightly graze at first with maybe young stock, and then you don't let it get too strong after after sowing it and it establishes itself?
If you compare to a grass only sward, say you're grazing it after 7 or 8 weeks, I would advise people to give it an extra 2 weeks after that, just to let those herbs get an established root, because it's quite fine at that early stage. So it's very important just to hold back in the first grazing to allow it to get established.
Okay.
Some people are finding the herbs aren't lasting any longer than 2 years, so part of that could be that initial grazing, just setting the herbs back too much.
So really, you're looking for for those in herbs to be more strongly established anyway, so they're not impacted by the that grazing just as much.
Yeah.
And with regard to, I suppose, persistency of the individual species, and how long can a farmer expect? Obviously, there's a lot of variables here, but how long can a farmer expect that one of these swards will kind of maintain the species diversity that they, I suppose contributes all the advantages to using them in the first place?
Yeah, it depends on management. It can be 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. But the thing to remember is that you've sown, for example, the 6-way mix perennial ryegrass, timothy, red clover, white clover, chicory, and plantain. Say your herbs are gone after 3 and 4 years, the chicory will be the first to go. What they've done to your soil in those first couple of years is immeasurable. So they've added to your soil structure. And what you find after, say, 4, 5, 6 years, you still have a nice field of grass and clover. So all's not lost. You don't have, because the herbs don't last any longer than 3 or 4 years, doesn't mean you have to reseed it after 3 or 4 years.
And Thomas, can on that point, can we, after those 3, 4 years, when maybe the herbs have, might be kind of dying off in them, or they're not as many herbs as there was maybe in year 1, 2, and 3, but is there, can you stitch in those herbs again? Can you, like stitching in clover, can you do that with those herbs successfully, so that you're kind of obviously trying to maintain the productivity of those swards?
Yeah. I suppose in theory, yes, you should. We're going to look a bit more in detail into that in the next couple of weeks with one of our partner farmers, and I know another one of our partners have done that into, say, an existing grass sward, not even an old herbal ley, but he went into an old grass ley and stitched in plantain, chicory, and white clover, and had reasonable success. So as you said, in 4 or 5 years' time, and that sward, it might be getting a bit open, so probably ideal conditions for oversowing. You'll have a lot of clay to get the new seed into and get the new plants established. So I would say, yeah, that's definitely an option, but we'll hopefully have more answers at the end of the summer for you on that one. Yeah.
Okay. And with it's probably hard to get by one of these webinars without mentioning carbon anyway, but do we think that that they have, I suppose, it's likely that having these herbal leys or multi-species swards is going to, I suppose you're going to see a greater increase in soil carbon than perennial ryegrass swards? Or has there been any kind of work in that area?
I think yes, on the first principles, and I think there's some work in Rothamsted where they're looking at that exact aspect of soil carbon and soil health, and I think some of the initial results or the preliminary results are showing an increase or a slight increase. Again, carbon sequestration is a long-term process, but in the few years they have the trial, there's a slight increase in the herbal leys, and so as you'd expect that. We started talking about arable and cover crops at the start of the conversation. If you think of the root structure under a herbal ley compared to a ryegrass sward, and you've got all those different roots, you've got deep roots, shallow roots, and all that, and they're all adding biomass and biology to the soil, and they're burying carbon. The deeper rooting species are burying carbon a bit deeper down the soil, and it's a more productive system as well. So it's capturing more carbon, burying it deeper, putting it more safely into the soil than a shallow rooting species. So yeah, I think there definitely could be, and if carbon credits are to become a thing, you might get a few more carbon credits for having a herbal ley than a shallower rooting ley.
Okay. No, let's. I guess if with the persistency, and I suppose that's I suppose where the trying to manage these swards optimally is going to be very important, and that if farmers are using these and they're not finding that they're not working for them, and it requires them to cultivate again or to establish a new one, that is probably a thing that may outweigh any kind of buildup of carbon. But it certainly it would seem that there could be a lot of benefits from soil carbon point of view from establishing these multi-species swards. But I think on that, we're chatting now for the last 40 minutes, and I guess there's with regards to questions, if people would like to answer or ask any questions, feel free to type questions into the question box there that you have, that you can see. But we do have a question on looking at nitrogen fertilizer applications. So I'll just read out this question. Is there an optimum legume content which negates the requirement for nitrogen fertilizer applications? Can you suggest species which might be better suited to establishment on a floodplain, please? So there's kind of, I suppose, two questions in that. So I'm not sure.
Well, you can,
optimal legume.
Yeah, some of your just typical white clover and red clover don't really like wet feet, if you like. So there are other options out there, such as alsite clover, which would tolerate the wetter conditions or possibly lower pH. Something we're also looking into is strawberry clover, which is said to be able to survive underwater for a number of weeks. So something we're looking at, but no firm information on it as yet. So one to watch out for, I would say.
Bird's foot trefoil as well. Wetland plant as well, so, and a legume too, so maybe a little bit of that could help as well.
Okay, and from, I guess, from the question on the optimum legume content to negate the requirement for nitrogen fertilizer applications, is there, I think,
we'll be going about
20-30%. You were saying earlier, was it?
Yeah. Well, in terms of the seed mixture, you'll be putting on about 15% legumes, say split between red and white clover. But back to the practicals, it's not how much clover you put in. It's not how much clover is in the bag. It's how you manage it when you sow it. You'll make sure it's rolled before you sow it. That's more important than putting extra clover into the bag. And using the right fertilizer at the reseed, keeping a low end nitrogen.
So if you can get it to 20 to 30%, sorry, 25-30% is I think is a sweet spot for reducing your fertilizer. Yeah.
Okay, and what? So pretty much you're kind of advocating a low nitrogen kind of high P&K fertilizer, and I suppose obviously looking at soil analysis anyway, similar to that you would with establishing any crop. Damian, is that correct?
Yeah, a lot of horror stories. You go on the farms and some farmers are putting on like 20-10-10 on to reseeds, and even some people using straight nitrogen, and that's only going to push on the grass element and more than likely annual weeds too. It'll be to the detriment of the clover and the herbs. So a bit of education there.
Okay, and just, are you guys doing any, like, are there, with regards to the chicory and some of the actual those herbal species, so your chicory and plantain, are there different, are we really talking about just one variety here, or is it similar to clover and grasses, where there are a number of different species of chicory and or varieties of chicory and plantain, and they, is that the case, or?
It is, but I suppose it's only a new thing here. We haven't got that far down the line, and we actually have some. I think last week we sold some varieties, or a selection of varieties of chicory and plantain. So we'll be keeping an eye on those over the next couple of years to see different, if there's any different traits in them in production, or tendency to go to stem, and persistence obviously is the big one. So if you could find a more persistent variety, or find which one is the most persistent, then you'd be onto a winner there. Yeah. So,
Okay.
but again, it's early on in the breeding of these things. There's not as much work has gone into it yet compared to grass and clover.
We're also seeing variations in the amount of nitrate leaching from various varieties of plantain. From the environmental point of view and the nitrogen saving point of view, there's exciting work going on there.
Well, I think I read something about plantain in New Zealand, where swards that had a higher proportion of or where plantain was included had lower emissions. Particularly, I suppose a lot of the emissions are coming from the urine patches, and where plantain was included in the diet, it seemed that plantain was having some sort of an inhibitory effect on N2O emissions. I guess, does it matter with like, you know, are they looking at the grass portion, or particularly the perennial ryegrass, you know, within these multi-species swards? You know, are tetraploids more suitable, diploids, or, you know, early, late, intermediates? Is there anything you can shed any light on that?
Well, I get back to the spring growth potential. So you want a grass that's going to grow well in the spring, so try and pick varieties that are giving that spring growth, just to balance the production over the year. We'd be using a mixture of tetraploids and diploids. Doesn't seem to be in the past, tetraploids would be quite open, and some people would argue that the more open the grass, the more that especially the white clover can fill that gap. So an open tetraploid is an ideal companion for white clover. So we'd be using a mixture of tetraploids and diploids really, but we're not seeing much difference between varieties really.
Okay.
It's still going to be a pretty open sward, so I think diploids and tetraploids, it's not going to have a massive impact on it. Like 30% of the seed mix isn't going to be grass, so it's not the same as when we're sowing a grass only mixture, I suppose.
Okay. Now, just another question has come in, and I think we may have answered. Well, you know, how does the sward cope with cutting, or can the sward be cut? So that we kind of answered that, covered that question before. So yeah, I think to summarize, Thomas, I guess you can cut them, but it's probably not taking advantage of the full advantage of having these by cutting them. They're probably more suited to grazing to maximize their effects.
For cutting, you'd be better if it was an all-out cutting sward, you'd be better to put more emphasis on the likes of your red clover really. But if it's a multi-species herbal ley that you want, that has to be cut because of the higher water content on it, you would want to cut it dry, not ted it, just leave it for 24 hours and then peel it up.
Okay, and tedding it, the reason why not ted it out, Damian?
You can break up the red clover, particularly doesn't like being tedded so much.
Okay. Right.
Lose a lot of leaf.
And another question here: when considering bloat, is it ideal or necessary to have the whole grazing block in multi-species swards rather than take the risk of animals' diets changing on a regular basis? That's a good question.
Yeah, it always comes up. The risk varies during the year. When the clover is in flower, the flower itself contains anti-bloating agents. So when it's flowered, your risk is reduced. The high danger areas or high danger times are when you've got lush clover, say in September time, when the clover's not flowering. So you just wouldn't want to put your stock in hungry. So there'd be gorging on that. If you thought you were in a very high risk time, maybe it's very wet and you have high clover content, you might want to depend on a hybrid fiber source just to balance that out, or use some anti-bloating tools in the water perhaps.
We're not seeing much reports or any incidents of bloat really, especially with the herbal leys. Maybe it's something to do with the diversity and the extra species. It's not just grass and clover, you know. But again, as Damian says, if you're nervous, there's precautions that you can take. Yeah.
And there's not from a livestock, even from a performance point of view, you know, aside from the anything to do with bloat, but is there, you know, will, you know, if do livestock like grazing these? So I guess if they're going from a perennial ryegrass sward and they're being moved onto a multi-species sward, is there likely that they'll put their nose up at one or the other, or are they?
They might put their nose. Yeah. What you find the first time they're in it, they find it strange. They maybe eat the grass first, and you think they're not going to eat the herbs, and then they get a taste for the herbs and clean them all out, and then the next time they go into it, they'll be straight onto the herbs, and they would be preferentially grazing that. And that's why you would either strip graze it or rotationally graze it, because if you keep them in any longer for a long period of time, every time the herbs regrow, they'll be nibbling at that and reducing the persistency of it. They'll be preferentially grazing, especially chicory and plantain, and then the grass, they wouldn't be eating as much as the grass, and then that means the grass then dominates.
Okay, and just another question here: what are the mixed herbal root depths, and will they improve compaction issues? Will they increase evapotranspiration and plant available water capacity? And will they improve tons of dry matter per hectare? So there's a good few questions within that. But so I suppose take the first one: what are the the herbal root depths? If we kind of go through them one by one.
I go for that, or do you want, Damian? We do some share. So if we start with the deepest, your chicory there is going to be the deepest, and it's predominantly a taproot. I think you can go down to 1.5. Obviously depends on water content in the soil. It'll go further if it has to. It can get down to 1.5 meters, maybe 2 meters. Your plantain then is probably a little bit shallower, but it's more fibrous and probably a bit more wider ranging rather than a taproot. Red clover, more of a taproot as well. It'll go down deep. White clover, shallower, fibrous, and then your grasses are shallower as well, maybe a bit more fibrous or a bit more far-reaching in the timothy side. So there's a good diversity, and each of those species, I suppose, is operating in a different layer in the soil, so they're not competing directly with each other. The deeper ones are working in their own patch down below, shallower ones are up top. So that's why we can have them all in the mix together. They're not in direct competition. What was another one of the questions there, Philip?
Will they improve compaction issues?
Potentially, yeah.
They would, but you have to get the spade out, and you find that the likes of your chicory or the plantain, if you find the roots aren't going straight down, they're going down, maybe turning, then there's maybe a bigger problem, an underlying issue there. But over time it would help. But if you have a serious problem, those tap roots might have trouble getting down. Okay.
And then will they increase evapotranspiration and plant available water capacity? So I guess that's means there that obviously you know, soil structure and accessing more available water for the plant during drier times. And I suppose the last part of that, will they improve tons of dry matter per hectare?
Yeah, they'll improve dry matter per hectare at lower levels of nitrogen. And in terms of evapotranspiration, they would have a higher content of water than perennial ryegrass alone. So yes, and that's back to the issue of making silage from these. They have a higher water content, so yeah, it's very important to get that wilt before you would ensile it.
And just finally, a question on livestock performance, in that I guess where is the with regards to livestock performance, where is the likely where is the performance coming from on these swards? You know, is it from higher protein levels, from obviously including clovers, or is it a kind of a mixture of some of these? I think you alluded to, Thomas, or you may have mentioned it earlier on that these have deep, you know, they're accessing more minerals, they've deeper rooting, so they've higher mineral content. You know, where's the X factor? Where is it coming from with regards to these multi-species swards? And I suppose livestock performance is a very important aspect of these of any farmer looking to grow these.
Yeah, it's coming from each component is bringing something new. I always make the comparison between we'd be happy enough to eat potatoes for the rest of our lives. We would survive and we'd be fine. But if you add in carrots and you add in some meat and you're getting different nutrients from different plants and whatever, it's the exact same for the animals. They're getting a more balanced diet from having this diversity in their diet. So obviously the protein is a lot of the protein is coming from the legumes. There's plenty of protein in the likes of chicory as well. There'd be good sugar content in chicory as well. Mineral profile is good, and mineral profile is good in plantain too. So you're covering all bases by having all that diversity in the sward. And the intakes are up as well. Animals find it very palatable, so that's contributing to your animal performance too. They're eating more. It's going through them quick. It's passing through them quicker, so they can eat more. They can extract more nutrients from the sward that way too. So it's kind of the whole picture of what drives animal performance is the boxes are being ticked there with the herbal leys.
Okay, and is there, I suppose the final question, and it's just something that from me anyway, is that with regards to sheep, you know, are they I think there was work, you know, on UCD where there's excellent performance, I think, from multi-species swards with particularly with lambs, finishing lambs. But you know, typically if you've got using lambs, that they, you know, that there's no issues with multi-species swards and with regard to, you know, any of these herbal content of them and grazing them.
You find the lamb growth rates were 280 grams per day on the 6 species herbal ley compared to 240 with perennial ryegrass alone. Litter sizes were up. Sheep farmers are always scared of the red clover content affecting fertility. So, but if you look at the results on litter size, they're actually higher than perennial ryegrass alone. So farmers must realize that you're not putting them into a red clover sward, you're putting them into a herbal ley.
Okay.
And the amount of doses was reduced by half, and lambs were brought to slaughter 25 days earlier and possibly capturing a more lucrative lamb market.
Okay. Well, I think on that we're coming up to 2 o'clock here now, so I suppose finally like to thank both of you guys, to both yourself, Damian and Thomas, for taking the time out to join this webinar today. I've certainly learned a lot, and I hope those who've listened in have learned a lot too. And if anyone wants to contact Damian or Thomas, I'm sure if you Google your either of your names and put DLF after it, you'll get contact details for both of them. And similarly for myself, if you even want to direct questions to me, you know, I can forward that on to either Damian or Thomas. But yeah, just I'd like to thank both of you again, and thank you everyone for joining. And yeah, we'll finish up this webinar now. So good afternoon, everyone.
Right, thank you.
Thanks so much. See you.